Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us. As I've told you, the session will be fully held in English, and simultaneous interpretation is available. For any assistance, please don't hesitate to write us on the chat box. And please, for all your questions to Professor Ridson, please address them in the Q&A box. So I am Stephanie Bustani, and I'm very happy to be your host today. And I'm also very honored to have this KnowTalk with Joe Ridson, Honorary Professor at Maastricht University. Welcome, Professor Ridson.
Thank you.
So just to give you a little bit of background about Professor Ridson. So he's a Dutch national, physics engineer and economist. He has taught in different universities in the US and in the Netherlands. He was the Minister of Education, Culture and Science of the Netherlands from 1989 to 1998. He is actually one of the longest serving ministers of education in the world. Subsequently, he served as Vice President of the World Bank's Human Development Network and as President of Maastricht University. He has written or co-authored 14 books and many articles, often co-authored, in the fields of education, economics, public finance, and development economics. Welcome again, Professor Ridson. So first of all, to set the scene, could you please give us a little bit of background information and tell us what knowledge indicators may imply?
Right. So that was the topic in which we agreed I should talk. And dear audience, great that you're there. I very much like to draw you in, and that from the perspective of what you are doing at the moment, because you are one of the areas in which I do have some expertise. You can see from me that I've had a life also behind me in many directions. Also, Stephanie Bustani was so nice to mention that. So I speak from the background of also a professor, someone who is interested in to see how things work and analyze that. That's what professors do, people in academia. As a minister, and particularly as a minister from the perspective of what would I like to know about my field, about the society and my field, Minister of Education and Science and Culture. Also as an administrator in a university, what is the goal of a university? What is the knowledge you need to make it succeed in reaching that goal? And thirdly, as a policy advisor at the World Bank. And still, I'm doing quite a bit of policy work in the sense of trying to help governments, sometimes also other universities, to think about the future of their country or their university in the sense of what they may contribute. And that is where the knowledge indicators come in. So they are there, of course, to inform. They are not there as, say, loose pieces, sterile pieces. No, they are there for a purpose. That's what they are drawn up for. And that all started in my lifetime, no, but before my lifetime. I saw it happening first with national accounts, but then mostly concentrated when it was about what is relevant for policy, that is investment in physical capital. And from there on, it went to other elements. But first, important to realize this was all done on a national basis. So the national point of view is one which applies to indicators. So you collect knowledge indicators to show how your country is doing with respect to these indicators in order to, with a purpose, in order to achieve economic growth. And economic growth was always the perception behind knowledge indicators and behind also the driving forces of
خلف القوى المحركة للاقتصاد. عندما نتحدث عن القوى المحركة يتم تحديدها في حياتي على سبيل المثال. عندما كبرت
study economics jointly with physics, I noticed that human capital was at the process of being invented. It wasn't there in the full scale as we know it now. And it came across the board as something which we knew was important, but had never been as much realized. Human capital and knowledge came in as production factors because you couldn't explain the world anymore with only the accumulation of physical capital, with what countries do in order to generate more investments in machines and in buildings. That's physical capital. The only thing which I think also is important to notice in this process is that we talk about economic growth, but actually that is for a government not the main objective. It is really much more.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Professor Ridson. Do you want to share your screen?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
You are not able to do so?
Well, I have it on my own computer, but can you share it?
I sure can share it, but you can share it also yourself, so it would be easier for you to navigate. If you could click on share screen on the bottom of your screen, the green button, can you see it? Share screen.
No, I don't see the share screen.
So next to chat, Q&A, participants, can you see these features, these options?
Let me just, I go to
I can also try to share it.
Yes, if you could, because
yes, just a second.
Right. Right. Okay.
1 second. Okay.
Right. Okay. So
where
I'm here. Right.
One?
I'm going on to the third one, because anyway, what I just covered was up to the first two slides. So to where we are is we want to know what moves our country and in what way is what moves our country comparable to what happens in other countries. So the important point here is that human capital and knowledge are, as we know, even more important than physical capital, except that physical capital is something we can easily measure, we think. We measure it simply by US dollars or any other dinars invested in the country, or the accumulation of physical capital in terms of machines and buildings. Now there's something odd happening on the screen, but anyway, it's difficult to measure, and also it is embodied.
I'll try again.
Right.
Sorry.
No, this is our new form of communication. It's far less polluting than going across the ocean. And anyway, also in other real life settings, there may be problems.
Okay.
Right, yes, right, there
we are. Is it good now?
Yes, excellent. So the point about knowledge and human capital is that it's embodied, it's within people. And while you can sell and buy physical capital, machines or buildings, you can't do that with humans. That's at least something we feel is completely goes against our grain of human values. And also, it is very much a matter of a number of things which come together. And it's competencies, which are the way in which we express what the embodied knowledge, embodied in bodies of people is. We have quite a few measures developed in the time also when I was a minister. PISA is one in which I was very much chairing the meeting of ministers in the OECD. And we'll come back to that, but there was actually not always the feeling that it was good to measure project international student achievement, the achievements of 16, 17-year-olds in countries, because ministers felt maybe that is not going to work out too well for us. Same true with PIAC. They are measurements of competencies, of what youngsters can do. PIAC is Project International Assessment of adult competencies, of what people on the labor market can do. They are macro. There are 3 or 4 variables, and everything is combined in those variables. Detailed competencies, particularly those who count also for innovation, can also be proxied. You can also measure them, but we don't have as yet a full perspective of that. Some knowledge is not embodied. So that is the knowledge which is also the easiest to deal with, because that is captured in patents, and you can just look at the number of patents which are registered. And you can also look at the way in which those patents are being used. But that is only a very small part of knowledge. Most knowledge is in the minds of people. By the way, I very much proposed from the beginning that we use knowledge indicators to see how our countries work economically. But of course, there is a lot of knowledge which we also just collect without an economic purpose. And the way in which you also as a person may be interested in history or in literature, all kinds of things which are actually not immediately relevant. So then I go to the next slide. Yes, so now I come to a kind of a point where I very much want you to come in and give me an impression of where you stand with 2 points which are extremely relevant in terms of knowledge generation. First is, does knowledge have to be homegrown, or can it be also imported? Importing, the US imports a lot of knowledge through brain drain. But you can also import knowledge through expats. Can you please chat with me? Give me a reply in 2 sentences maximum. And also on the other question, suppose as a minister I have extra money for education, party programs, or simply a government decision, more money for education and research. What should I do? Should I try to increase enrollment, and increase the number of people who do research, or should I try to focus on increasing the quality of education and increasing the quality of research? Please also give me your reply. So then I take 3 minutes to wait for your replies, and then we continue from there. And the replies should be in the chat box, and I'm going now to look up the chat box.
We already have 2 answers, or 3. Khawla is saying both. Lama, knowledge can be imported. Jack is saying that it depends on the character of the individuals, also character, etc., and also their home upbringing. The quality, increase the research and quality of education. It is not only homegrown, it could be imported and adopted and learned. Increase the quality of research skills at school level and universities. It can be both, it can be both, can be imported.
Right. Yeah, I think you're all on the right track. And maybe I can now move to the next slide, where I make very much the point that it is about quality. But before saying that is particularly this question on the importing knowledge. Countries like the countries in the Middle East, the Gulf countries, have you might say, a knowledge deficit because they have not been part of knowledge development in the same way as it happened in the richer OECD countries. So here the perspective indeed is, if you don't have the knowledge, please bring it in. So the notion of expats is one which you very much would like to embrace as the notion of particularly knowledge expats. So knowledge expats will bring in the knowledge. At the same time, you want to make also as quickly as possible the change from having the knowledge there, which may be actually very temporary and may just return, to homegrown knowledge. So in this respect, I think the big point for the Gulf countries who are able to indeed bring in expats is how to make sure that you use them also to bring in the homegrown, to make the transition. For Saudi Arabia, I've been very closely connected with the NEOM project. In my view, that would be also an excellent opportunity to bring in expats and knowledge. Comparing throughout the Gulf countries, you notice that the United Arab Emirates is on top in terms of knowledge through the expats. You have Oman, but then Saudi Arabia is much lower. I think in the Vision 2030, you'll see also with Neom City and with other investments, that's not only about investments, but it's also about investments will bring in knowledge. But the conditions for that are important. But then going to the point about quality, I think some very good remarks were being made about quality, that it also is not quality just of universities. That is quite often not in the perspective. It's particularly also very important to invest in the early years. But quality was in itself not discovered until, you might say, the period of, say, after 2000, after we introduced PISA. That's this project, International Student Achievement, which now is being shared by 54 countries. Originally, and that was particularly the breakthrough work of Barrow and Lee, there was the notion it's simply years of education. That is important for productivity, that is important for economic growth. And nowadays, we know with the results from PISA and also with the results from the Project International Assessment of Adult Competencies, that it is particularly the quality of education. Scores in PISA, scores in PIAC are very relevant for economic growth. So the names connected with that is particularly Hanushek, Woosman also. So then we go to the next slide. And then I wanted to show you, give you an impression of the knowledge of adults. So that is with data from PIAC. You can see, and I did this with a PhD student who got his PhD also on this notion, is the quality of your of the labor in a certain sector. If you want to have a strong sector of electronics, then don't look very much at production processes, don't look too much at patents, don't look at all the things. Look at first at the level of knowledge of your workers. The same is true in all other sectors. And look also at the way in which in that country, in your country, the activities in the labor market are supported by research. So R&D and cognitive skills together make for productivity. So sectors which survive or which come out to be dominant are the sectors with high levels of, say, quality of human capital and also associated research. And so that notion is adult competencies contribute to sectoral competitive strength. And you see increasingly that that notion also is one which definitely Singapore has taken on, but also most of the OECD countries have taken on. And then we go to the next slide. And one of the surprising things is that competencies of graduates, of university graduates, well, you would imagine they all can do the same thing. And definitely you would think in the European Union and also in OECD countries, now, well, if you are from a good university, you should be able to do the same thing. Not so. And interestingly enough, this comes from PIAC. This is about 20 to 30-year-old graduates of universities. in Finland, the Netherlands, Japan, Sweden, etc. So it's a comparison. You see the average, you see also the distribution of the competencies around it. And the interesting part of it is if you make a correlation between those notions and the level of innovation as indexed, for example, in an innovation index, then you see a very close going together. So you notice that quality of higher education in terms of competencies of the graduates which come from that university is important. And by the way, there's no reason to assume that that is not something you can work on in your own country. There's no reason why in Italy, students could not achieve the same level of competency at the end of their graduate studies as in Finland or the Netherlands or Japan. No reason, because when this Italian student comes to the Netherlands, he will have the same competencies as the Dutch student when he comes from the university. So in that respect, this is a serious question about how do we organize our universities, how do we organize our education, how do we organize our knowledge development. Yes. And then I come to one of the last slides, that is that indeed, on all of these respects, you see that productivity, employer satisfaction hangs together with human capital, competencies, and also R&D. Top publications are related to employer satisfaction. You wouldn't imagine that because it's so so remote from each other, but it's a culture in the country in which those things relate. And then I come to the next slide. And so this is I call this my song, my knowledge ballot. They used to be focused mostly on research. That's where knowledge notions came from. But we should think first and foremost about people, about the embodiment. And that's the competencies built in pupils and in students. And it does contribute to the economy. That is not what a government has in mind as the only thing. Of course, it is very much looking at making sure that there is sufficient income, there's not too much poverty, etc. But actually, at the end, it's about happiness. But here we can make very much the case, as I've done also myself in several writings, that knowledge contributes to happiness. And then in all of these things, it's the quality which counts. And so that is my ballot, and I look very much forward to, thank you very much for being so attentive and for responding to my question. And so I go to Stephanie for the further discussion and for the questions and answers.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Ridson. That's a really insightful presentation. I have a few questions for you before we move on to the questions from the audience, and I invite the audience to drop their questions in the Q&A box. So, as a policymaker and a practitioner, I want to ask you about the relevance of these knowledge indicators. So, as a previous minister, could you tell us a little bit how do decision makers really benefit from the knowledge indicators because we always hear that knowledge indicators are supposed to guide and inform policy making, but does that really happen and how? Thank you.
Yes, no, Stephanie, thank you very much for that question, because that is very much, I think, the reason why I so much support knowledge indicators. You want to know. It is important also for you might say, the political debate with the population, within the government, to make sure that you know where you stand and what you can do better, or where you can improve the livelihoods of people. So, no, from that perspective, I think that also all of the governments in OECD countries are very much aware of the fact of where they stand. They also contribute to a lot of debate. And here it's always the say there are two ministers who feel that they can go together. That's the Minister of Economic Affairs and the Minister of Education and Science. They can work together in this respect because the Minister also of Economics will always think about knowledge as important for the development of the country.
Thank you, Professor Ridson. So another question about data fallibility and like the issue of lying with data or data unavailability. So like sometimes some countries, they lie with their data, and how can we detect all this?
Right,
and
yeah.
What can we do about it?
So this has been my experience in the World Bank, but also in years before that, some countries are actually very much in the state in which they, on the political level, feel that data are a threat because the data may show that you're not doing so well. And so you like then to manipulate data or just be not too clear about data. So this is something in which every government has to come to itself, because in the end, you lose out as a country. And also as a minister, you're aware that you're not living there for that moment, but that you also want to be known as having done the right thing, say some 20 years after that. So in that respect, also, I think ministers feel in general quite responsible for making sure that proper data are collected. It is not so easy, and it is not such an easy debate, because quite often politically, data may turn against you. There was a discussion when we talked about PISA, in which one of the countries' ministers said, that was in the OECD, said, but what happens if my country turns out not to be so highly productive in education with bad PISA results, which indeed happened? And I said, well, in my view, that is reassuring, because then you know that you can do something about it. If you don't know it, you can't do something about it. So no, data availability is important. It looks quite often, why should we collect all those data? But data are extremely important to be informed. I mean, it's just like, so in this respect, I also would argue as a physicist, if you don't know your data, then you can't invent electricity. You can't send a rocket to the moon. You can't have a car which is driving. You need the data in order to be able to drive the economy.
This is so true. I couldn't agree with you more. And as they say, like you can't manage something you can't measure. Like you need to measure something in order to be able to manage it and develop it and make it better. So I had few more questions prepared, but we have lots of questions in the Q&A box. So I'll take now a question from Professor Hugo Hollanders. So he's asking, how can countries then improve the quality of their educational systems, assuming that there are no differences in students' learning abilities across countries?
That's an amazing question, on which also throughout my life, actually, I've done quite a lot of research. And where we have now a book by a professor, Hattie, which is called Visual Learning, which looks into total 500 different studies which have been done on the way in which you organize education for the best results. So that is what it is about. And we know here exactly what it is. It is the quality of the teacher. So it's a matter of making sure that you have the circumstances to attract the best teachers, and also to give them the opportunity to teach, say, more or less according to what they have learned and what they know. The minister doesn't know how to teach. I mean, the minister should provide the circumstances for good teaching. And the good teaching should be one in which, first of all, salaries are sufficient to have good teachers. That is something which is not the case in many countries. And at the same time, then attract very good people and give them the opportunity to teach. Hugo, is that a good answer?
We should ask Professor Hollanders.
Okay.
But yes, it is a great answer. So following on the previous question and on your answer, Zina Anime is asking, how should policymakers in developing countries consolidate the ever-increasing gap between educational outcomes of private versus public institutions, which also exacerbates inequality?
Right. Yeah. So I can see that as a huge problem of our world. The general problem of a increase in income inequality almost worldwide, but then turning into an inequality which is persistent because the rich can afford things for their children, which the poor cannot, or the people who are not in the top 10% of the population. That is, in a way, a recipe for disaster. The only ways in which that can be done is through both national and international efforts. So in the World Bank, I think we were quite, when I was there, we were quite successful in establishing substantially more money for education for developing countries. Still, it's not enough. This was the Global Education Fund. And I now realize that the World Bank is spending 5 billion extra in education as a result of the COVID crisis. That is not enough. And so I think a worldwide effort to make sure that education in those countries which do well, which are serious in their education efforts, that those countries also should be better supported. At the same time, what I also plead for in European countries is a word which is quite often makes me a person a bit outside of the political debate because they don't like it. That's the word taxation. Without taxation, you don't have a good public sector. So you need to always look around for taxation. And now here we have the problem that in low-income countries, also the level of taxation is generally quite low. It's no more than 10, 15%. My example here is always juxtaposed to it. It's in the Netherlands in the 15th century, when the Netherlands was also a poor country, had a level of taxation of 50% of income. So here, it's not only something for the developing countries themselves, but it's also a matter also of the world community, because often business, international business in developing countries doesn't pay taxes. And they should also be taxed, but that can only be done by a worldwide agreement. So this goes in a bit of a different direction, but the one and the most important part, which I noticed as a minister, was important to me is money. I need the money, and without money, I can't do anything. I need the money to pay teachers well, and I need the money to simply have children in school, but also to have the teachers in the public sector, which are well paid.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Busanan Rokia. So, like following your talking about the like some countries like outsourcing knowledge. So she is asking, why do we talk about importing knowledge and not exchanging knowledge, which stems from the peculiarity of each society and thus enriches the field of knowledge?
Well, it is, I think, an excellent question because quite often expats are also an expression of brain drain from one country to the other country, and not always associated also with brain circulation. It would be really nice to bring brain circulation around, but I see this also happening in Europe, in which the Central and Eastern European countries lose a lot of their good people to Western Europe without having a proper turnaround. And in my view, once again, it is cooperation between countries. I think this is not a world in which we are better off by doing all of our own thing and excel in it. It's a world in which we should excel jointly with others and indeed help each other on the way. So in this respect, I've been all my life been pleading very much for associations between universities in richer countries and in poorer countries, so that you help each other in this way, so that it also becomes important to stay in your own country and not just go because opportunities are much better. In the World Bank, we established the African Economic Researchers Network, which gave money to African researchers. We also try to establish very much research institutes with an endowment on which the institute could live and researchers could be kept in the country. I think this is a trend where world cooperation is extremely important. So this is something you will always hear. This is one world, and it's not going well with that world unless we make definitive steps to work more together.
Definitely. Now back to policy making. How can policymakers keep balanced investment on physical resources and human resources to attain actual effective development?
Yes, excellent point. And I would say from my own research, but also from what I'm reading from other people, fiscal investment always comes when you have the people, when you have the drive of the entrepreneur, when you have the drive of the top society, and then the money comes. Money is no longer a scarce resource, it seems. It is in some countries which are not able to attract the right people. So when I look at also the United Arab Emirates, so I'm a great admirer of the development model of the United Arab Emirates and also of Singapore, who did the right thing. They started with education. China these days is also completely starting with education, and the rest will follow. So if you have a good proposition, if you have good people who can think about something, the money follows easily. When you look at the US nowadays, all these big firms, Tesla, didn't started with smart people and smart skills. Facebook started with those things. These days, we think of Facebook as a rich company. It was completely funded on the basis of almost zero investment, and then had good people and attracted lots of money on the stock market and came in as rich. So forget about fiscal investment, I almost would say, because that will follow. Money is, when it's under the right conditions, of course, you have to have the confidence if you are an investor that you get the return, that there's it's a stable country, so you have to ensure stability, and that's also dependable, that you're sure you can trust that the money will come back. But then the balance is an easy one. Always go for the human capital.
Always human capital. Okay.
Human capital first. Not America first, but human capital first.
Human capital first. Okay. Now back to the question of the issue of data availability. So if countries can manipulate data, what is the role of international organizations like the UN to quality check these data so that the general public will not be misled?
That's an amazing question, because I've had some experience. I used for my dissertation, I used the data from the UNESCO Institute of Statistics.
Yes.
And I looked at them and I said, this is just, they call it BS in an abbreviation, another word which you have to express in full. They are completely irrelevant, the data. And then the UNESCO asked me to think about a new setup in which the data would be controlled. And so indeed, we set that up. That's the UNESCO Institute of Statistics now in Montreal. And I was the first chair also of the supervisory board. And what we did was simply to say to the countries that we would not publish them as they were submitted, but we would put them in an asterisk and say not dependable. And we would indicate why we didn't believe that they were correct. So this was a lot of effort. At UNESCO itself, this played up in a great way because the ambassadors there said, you can't do that to our country. And I said, well, one way or the other, we are not going to do that. These are the data on education, which are, by the way, these days, very good data. If you're not willing to go along with that, we can't just have this institute. So it is a role, it's a very difficult political role, but I think that the world community is ready to accept that. Now, not always easy, but the notion that statistics are not your property, are not your thing to generate, but are available for your population and in that respect for the world is one which we, I think, might want to express much stronger in United Nations fora. So there I agree in full that we need to have a discussion on this. First of all, if you're misleading with data, you're first of all misleading your own people. It's not so as much that you're misleading others, but you're not simply doing your job. So you're deceiving your people. And I think that is something in which we should express that data should be holy, should be guaranteed, correct, and internationally also certified.
It is so true. And also, like, we have faced the same problem in the Knowledge Project while collecting data for the Global Knowledge Index. So as you know, we've been producing it since 2017. And like every year when we want to collect data, so you mentioned the database, I'm not gonna repeat it. So it's the same database. So when we check for some values on education, we see that no, like some values don't make sense. And like for some values and for some countries, like you can easily detect it. You can just see the trend. And sometimes like you have values for, like, let's say enrollment in secondary education, let's say. So it's 20%, 25%, 23%, and then it's 80% on the next year. Yeah. So yes. Yeah. So we always go back to the database and we ask them, and like they are always so responsive, and sometimes they remove some data points because they notice that they do not really make sense.
Yeah, so it would be important, I think, to have a discussion at the United Nations level about the importance of public data which are reliable, and about not manipulating data, and simply for the purpose of international comparisons, but also for people in their own country, that they know what is really happening.
Yes. Okay, someone is asking, it's a question in Arabic, trying to translate it. Okay, so he's asking, what are the data that policymakers should hide from the citizens?
Right, I would say none. My notion was always that if you have data which indicate a problem, then you have a job. That is why you're there. But that is not always true for most politicians. I must say I was in this respect quite unusual. Most politicians like only to see things which go well in their country. So it is, but particularly quality data are things which policymakers don't like to see, because also some countries like Germany did not so well in the early PISA midterms. At the same time, other countries like, in this respect, I feel China and also Singapore, Asia has given a great stimulus to indeed look at data. And they have, from the beginning, they have been participating in data collections in a way in which he said, we don't want to hide because we like very much to make sure that we do better. So it is, I think the general notion is on the question is never hide data. Everything is important to know, and particularly if it's not very good, it means that you have to do better in order to help your people.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Always with transparency.
Yeah.
And yes, and also this is how like we can see how a country is improving. So sometimes it's good to see that like we started from nothing and then like we're on the right track, we're improving. We still have like 4 minutes. I'm gonna try to ask 2 more questions before wrapping up. So what is the limitation of knowledge right? Why you must pay more to know more?
Right, yeah. Well, it is a matter of having the time and effort. What the trajectory is of knowledge acquisition in a person is quite amazing in the sense that it actually is something in which the extra costs for more knowledge may not always be rising, in fact, may be decreasing. Once you have had a lot of knowledge, it's also easy to go in other directions. So there is, it is important in knowledge acquisition to have a good mentorship. So the circumstance, so that's where the teacher is so important. And when I think about the teacher and also think about my own learning, it's not always the formal education. Once you grow up, when you are in jobs, you notice that there have been people from whom you have learned so much. In terms simply also of real acquisition of knowledge on fields, that people help you guide, let you see things. Sometimes they are colleagues. So learning is not something which stays with the school, but there also the quality of your environment is extremely important. If these are people who are highly knowledgeable, then of course that gives you also much more chance to learn.
So I was just speaking with the organizers, and it seems like we can extend our chat a little bit, if that's okay with you.
Perfect.
7 more minutes, or so all in all, like 10 more minutes. We wrap up. Okay, because we have lots of really good questions.
And I'm most grateful for all of you to be so much engaged.
Okay, so oh, I lost the question. Okay, here it is. What is the impact of exponential technology on current education systems, and how can we initiate initiatives at the country level to bridge the gap of technological skills needs?
That's a really excellent question. We are heading in a direction in which the specializations become larger, in which the big tech firms, we're now at Zoom. Zoom didn't exist. Well, we had Skype some years ago, but now Zoom has taken on. We have something like 20 different Zoom types. We have also now artificial intelligence to look at the other side, to inform companies on the way in which they can sell things, because that's where what big tech lives from. They earn their money from advertising and pointing to people. So huge development there, and the real danger that if you're not already advanced, that your that catch up becomes more difficult. So in this respect also, I would say first of all, don't give up, always try, but also secondly, make this a point in which you have to run harder. I think once again, for me, the agenda for Oman, the agenda for the Vision 2030, and also the visions for the United Arab Emirates are excellent examples of ways in which you try, even when the exponential increase in technology is being observed, still to catch up. But the one important thing is indeed to make no compromises on data, to know where you are. And also the second one is to do your utmost and make sure that it is on the quality of your education and of your research, and make no kind of compromises around the quality. Make sure that you have by far the best quality. Now, just to give an indication of what can go wrong in this respect, and what I think is also a tremendous cultural aspect, it's very much related to the question of private education in developing countries. In a advice for Uzbekistan, which I participated, I said one of the major things is you have to make sure that you have the final exams done in an objective way, because it came out that you could almost buy your final exam. Now, that is a sure recipe for disaster, because it means that the children from the well-to-do can buy an exam and admission to the university without having the competencies, while children from another background will not have that opportunity. So it is a something in which I feel it's very difficult to engage in a discussion about culture, but catching up in technology and in knowledge requires also a culture of taking everyone in. So equality of opportunity, that is the word which is quite often used. That's the way to say from that is good to have in a society. It's no longer good to have, it's making sure that you have it everywhere, because you need all the talents and you need to develop all the talents and not just the talents of the top 10%.
Yes, definitely. That's very true. And there are always like hidden talents that we need to benefit from. So now another question: can countries also be overeducated? If you work on indicators, you know that more is not always better, that you can also overinvest. Imagine a country where everyone has a university education. This would create issues in filling up a whole range of jobs. How to determine the optimal knowledge investments?
Right. Yeah, it's an amazing conversation, because I had this as a minister in 1981. 1991. So, most of you were not even born then. But
this is when I was born in 1991.
Right, no, it's good year. It's a good year. 1991, in the Netherlands, enrollment in universities went up. And one of the professors in the Dutch university said, oh, this minister is creating over-education. And so we went through a whole period in Europe in which the number of students who went to university increased. And in fact, actually, the number of university graduates is four times the one which was existed in 1990 nowadays. So now what happened was that through two different processes, but those who were highly educated didn't find easily jobs. They found also jobs on higher levels of pay than the previous generation. So how come this is not economic? That doesn't economically make sense. A larger supply of people, so all on the labor market. So the employers can pick and choose, and would say that that they only want to have the very best, and the rest will become unemployed. That didn't happen. So the number of jobs kept not only track with the number of graduates, but it even increased. And so even now, higher education graduates are more scarce than people with lower degrees of education. And that has a lot to do with the changes in the production process, in the way in which we work. You need increasingly well-trained people. And that is the technology increase, so the technology spiral almost, which you see. And where the interesting part is that it's the people themselves who create jobs. So once you are a say, physics graduate these days in Eindhoven, and you create your own company. 50% creates their own company, and they do actually pretty well. So the center now of chip machine production, it's not the chip, the computer chips, the machines which make the computer chips is in Eindhoven, completely from graduates from the university. And so in this respect, also universities have changed and have prepared people to be their own entrepreneur, to come with a startup and then with a scale-up. So the limits of university training is very much determined by what the background of people is, how well they can qualify for a good university training.
Thank you so much. I don't think we can take any more questions. It's already 6 or 7 here, so we're already 7 minutes over the time. So we're just making up the missing time at the beginning. I'd like to thank you so much, Professor Ridson, for a great and a really insightful talk. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I think that each of the topics and each of the questions that were asked deserves a session in itself. Thank you once again, and I'd also like to thank our dear audience for all their questions. And I'm sorry for not being able to ask all the questions, but we can keep the conversation going on the hashtag KnowTalks. I'll write it in the chat now on all social media platforms. And I'd also like to thank Jibril for the interpretation. Thank you, Professor Ridson.
And thank you very much. And thank you very much, audience. It was a great pleasure to be here.